Professor Wilcox, welcome to the Policy Scoop.
Thank you for having me.
You're welcome. Very happy to have you.
We've been planning this episode for a while. We've had your former colleague Noah Deitch on already, and he will come back soon as well. But yeah, obviously, you have such a breadth of experience in carbon management, and given our target audience, which is really policymakers, we'd love to chat to you about all the things you've learned along the way.
Great.
Where should we go, Eva?
I'll let you get started, Sebastian, and then I have also one general question, and I guess then we get more specific.
Cool. So I guess I'd really like to start with your experiences at the DOE and in the management of carbon in the carbon management department, and really understand what's your experience. What was your experience then, but also how has it changed, you think, since you've left? Because that's what I think a lot of people will also be interested in, as much as you know, because obviously there will be things that you're not privy of anymore. But I'd love to understand, how was it then and how is it now in your perspective?
Yeah, I started at the first day of the administration in the Biden administration, and you recall too, back then we were coming off the Trump 1 administration. And so it was an interesting time because at that time, when I started too, I was heading up not just carbon management, but the fossil energy in carbon management office. And a lot of what the prior administration before Biden was focused on is really, how can we produce more energy, not really thinking about environmental impacts, certainly not thinking about climate. And so in February 2021, in the Biden administration, there was an executive order that said no more subsidies in fossil fuels. And that essentially meant when we looked at our budget, making sure that the dollars that are going out the door are not subsidizing further production of fossil fuels, but instead, kind of flipping it, right? And asking, how is this industry creating environmental impacts? How is this industry impacting climate goals? And how can we help industry to minimize climate and environmental impacts? So the dollars that were going out the door through our office is supporting industry still in the fossil industry, but helping it so that they're minimizing their impacts in terms of environment and climate. And so that's how we had to kind of have the lens of the dollars that we were spending. And it meant at that time reorganizing the office and thinking about, looking and scrutinizing every dollar out the door and making sure it wasn't dedicated to getting more oil, gas, and coal out of the ground. And now how has it changed? In the second administration under Trump, it's trying to go back to what that was, but even harder than it did the first time. And so, and have heard, they've also done a reorganization, and not just an organization of our former office, but the entire Department of Energy. A lot of the agencies within the U.S. government have done reorganizations and also cut significant federal staff, which makes it really difficult to do some of the things that Congress actually wants the government to do, to see dollars get spent in a way for the impact that is valued to taxpayers in Congress. Makes it difficult when you actually don't have the technical expertise to execute at the end of the day.
So we probably will talk a lot about things that have changed or will likely change. But I'm curious to understand if you look at now at the last 3-4 years of carbon management policy in the US, is there anything you see that is still intact, kind of a red thread that keeps going through and it hasn't been cut? It continues. Like what comes to mind when you think about this?
Yeah. Well, over the past few years, we'll start with the things that did get passed and kind of what's degraded. And so the bipartisan infrastructure law, or the bill, that was really all the capital investments for first-of-a-kind demonstrations. And that's what we've seen a lot of impact in terms of negative impact, right? Like dollars being frozen and projects being canceled, first of a kind demonstrations, not just carbon removal, but industrial decarbonization like cement and steel. Really exciting first of a kind projects for decarbonization just getting cut. So that's the bipartisan infrastructure law. The second piece of legislation that was passed in August 2022 is the Inflation Reduction Act. The Inflation Reduction Act is all the tax credits. And so you're still seeing a lot of tax credits that are still, like you said, going through. The most popular one for us, I think, is 45Q. One thing that happened in July under the One Big Beautiful Bill is that there's equity now for 45Q associated with utilization and geologic storage. And I think many people see that as a green light for enhanced oil recovery because that's CO2 utilization and storage. But it's also a green light for converting carbon into materials that are long-lived. Like if the carbon is stored in a carbonate material for construction, that also counts. If the carbon is stored in a long-lived plastic, for instance, with CO2 as a chemical feedstock, that also could count. So I think that it should be looked at through a broader lens and not just equated to EOR in terms of that equity. And of course, if it's direct air capture as the CO2 source, it's $180 a ton. And so that could be significant depending on the pathway of direct air capture. The other, I think that another tax credit that's interesting but is also kind of in question is 45V. That's also related to carbon removal because it's hydrogen. And so if you're thinking about hydrogen from biomass as a feedstock, 45V becomes really important. And I think some of those companies that are looking at pathways of biomass to hydrogen have to weigh like 45V and the uncertainties or 45Q for the carbon because you can't stack them. And so I think, in terms of the tax credits, they still exist. They didn't go away. But in terms of the first of a kind demonstration dollars, those are limited right now.
A lot of follow-up questions, but before I get to kind of the bigger ones, maybe first on the last point you made. I mean, the two major projects that people heard of from the DOE was obviously the DAC hubs and the public purchase price, right? So those two, as far as I understand, they haven't been canceled, but they've been on pause and probably indefinitely. Like, what's your take on those two signature projects?
I have lots of takes, but I'll try not to get too scattered. First, I'll just, on a positive, hopeful note, I'll just say that the companies that submitted proposals for direct air capture hubs and also for the purchase price were really thoughtful and strategic in terms of where those projects were getting sited. They oftentimes you'll see these projects in what we call red states, in other words, states that voted for the current administration. And so what does that mean? It means that at the end of the day, these projects aren't just delivering carbon removal, they're delivering jobs to communities. They're delivering opportunities for developing a new workforce. There's just so many reasons for there to be local advocates, bipartisan, both sides in regions. And so that part, I think, is really important to just recognize. And so this question of are they paused, are they stopped? There's two different pieces that are happening. I think it's confusing unless you grew up here and live in the United States, is that there's Congress, and Congress is essentially, the authority that appropriates the dollars themselves, the taxpayer dollars, appropriates them. And it's essentially law. And so the administration has to then, through its agencies like the Department of, Energy, the Environmental Protection Agency, the Department of Transportation, through all of these different agencies, has to take those dollars and responsibly put them out the door, essentially, towards these projects. Now, and that's just how things are supposed to happen. And when an administration is aligned with Congress, that is what happens, And we're in a position now that's very different in the United States where Congress has gotten really excited about these projects. And we see it in the 2026 appropriations.
That was another question I had for you.
Yeah. So we see it and it's like, awesome. This is a huge win. It means that there are Republicans, Democrats in the House, in the Senate that are excited about carbon removal, and not just direct air capture hubs and the purchase price, but marine CDR and MRV, which is critical to all of our approaches. And so that's exciting and hopeful. And that is, to me, no accident. It's because these companies have been so thoughtful, so strategic. We have think tanks like WRI, Carbon 180, that are out there really talking and communicating the need and the impacts that carbon removal could have. But now flip it, and back to your question, what's happening? Is it paused, frozen? Is our dollars being kind of, pulled back? And I think what now is happening is that we have these appropriations that are at the same time as a new-ish administration doing a reorganization. And so you can see online the reorganization of the Department of Energy. And the office that I oversaw is not going to exist anymore. So it's not fossil energy and carbon management. All of the equities, mostly all of the equities in our former office are going into a new office called geothermal and hydrocarbons. Now, the way that the appropriations works for 2026, they have to use the old, terminology. That reorganization is not effective yet. Probably in the next appropriations, they'll have to use those new words. Now, if you think about all of the office, like all the boxes, like carbon removal, carbon storage, point source carbon capture, hydrogen with carbon capture, like all of those equities that were in carbon management still exist, but they're going to be under geothermal and hydrocarbons. And I'll just add, in that new office, rebranded, I'm excited that geothermal's there, because I always have seen geothermal as being aligned with geologic storage. The same workforce that pulls oil and gas out of the ground is a workforce that's going to help with geothermal. Geothermal coupled to direct air capture is a beautiful thing. So like all of these, to me, is a good thing. The other change that I think is not obvious to the outside, fossil energy and carbon management, when Noah Deitch and I were there, reported up to the Undersecretary of Science. Now, what that means is that our mandate and our dollars were mostly spent on R&D. But what's true about this space now? It's not about lab science anymore. It's about pilots and demonstrations. In the new reorg of DOE, in this current administration, it reports directly up to the Secretary of Infrastructure instead. And I think that's a positive. Yeah, because it's shifting, right? And it's saying, hey, the Office of Science at DOE and the national labs are, in some cases, are focused on kind of fundamental science and R&D. But this stuff is beyond. And that's because a lot of the dollars that went out the door, the number of companies that have emerged in carbon removal since we started in 2021 at DOE, has really exploded, and it's an exciting space. Now, to really finally answer your question, is this just the funding and these programs, the purchase prize, the DAC hubs? I do feel like everything feels a little frozen right now with appropriations stacked on top of a reorganization. I think that the dust needs to settle, a little bit. And my hope is that we will see some dollars still to go through as the administration starts to align with Congress. We're not there yet. And if the priorities feel, at least when I look at the news, because I'm not in the government anymore. And so it's like nuclear, energy dominance, critical minerals, these are geothermal. But these are some of the things that we hear a lot in the current administration. And I think we, as the CDR community, I think it is time to get creative in the United States again and ask ourselves, are there ways to do some of these approaches that also move those other approaches forward alongside them? And I think that they'll probably, if we can't align with the administration on these priorities, then what will happen is there'll be unobligated dollars in this administration. And assuming there's a new administration in a few years, those unobligated dollars will be able to be spent in that time.
this is what Noah was telling me, which I thought was really interesting, because that's not how it works in Germany, for example, is that if this money is not spent, it moves to the next year, right? So
That's
like
correct.
basically a couple of years later,
Yeah.
when if it
Yeah.
hasn't been spent, another administration can pick it up and spend it.
That's correct.
That's super interesting. Cool.
Yeah, but it's not very efficient from a taxpayer perspective. You know, we vote and like you want to see the funds go to what you're voting for, you know?
That's one thing. And also from climate perspective, we need the projects to get started as soon as possible.
Absolutely.
So every year that is lost is also the year where we lose the chance of reducing emissions and removing CO2 from the atmosphere, which is not ideal. But what is your take if you look at the next 2 or 3 years? There's obviously a lot of uncertainty right now to really kind of take stock, but what kind of impacts could the available funding have on the projects on the ground in the next 2 to 3 years? Like, could projects count on something? On which level? Like, what is your expectation?
Yeah, I mean, I would have to, you know, be able to read the future because you really can't make predictions in this current administration. And right now, it doesn't feel aligned with what Congress is appropriating. That's what it feels to me. But having said that, there are states that have their own policies in place that are very supportive to carbon removal and moving forward. I mean, I'll say, you know, an example. If you're a direct air capture company and you're trying to figure out where you want to build a demonstration, there are certain states that have 100% clean electricity goals, you know, that are before 2035 even, because they have energy resources like hydro or wind or nuclear that allow them to have those kinds of aggressive timelines. And so to me, it's like aligning, you know, direct air capture in communities and regions that have those low carbon energy resources to fuel the direct air capture will have greater impact and quicker and sooner. And also typically in the low carbon energy is more affordable for them in terms of just operating expenses. And so I think that, you know, in California has the low carbon fuel standard, which is exciting, you know, so I think that we just have to be thinking about, you know, when we think about demonstrating these technologies, what states in their priorities and their culture and their policies could potentially align so that these technologies have greater impact. Because ultimately, I see a lot of the federal incentives that we put in place, one of them being the Carbon Negative Earthshot, which is one of the first Earthshots that we launched when we were at DOE. And the point of that was a wonderful thing. You know, it was across all the carbon removal pathways. The idea was we had a target of getting down to $100 a ton. And everybody thought that's a crazy magic number, you know, but the idea wasn't that today we could get down to $100 a ton. It was if we have these millions of dollars, hundreds of millions of dollars over 10 years and we invest and we're getting from thousands of tons of removal today to millions of tons to hundreds of millions of tons, we learn by doing, we get down the cost curve, and something that's $600 a ton today, maybe it could be $100 realized, but we have to get to that scale. And only can we get to the scale with these kinds of investments. So I think right now, without those investments in place, without the Earthshot funding, that the companies have to be strategic. They have to align themselves with these other things that do have funding. Don't do direct air capture in a vacuum. Do it alongside geothermal. Do it alongside nuclear. Those things are being financed today in a heavy way. You know, if you're looking at mineral carbonation, is there a way to take mine tailings and co-produce critical minerals and rare earth elements at the same time? There's money in that, you know? So I think it's not a time to say, oh, there's no federal funding for CDR. It's a time to say, how can we continue to be creative to push these projects forward?
And this is exactly kind of the direction I wanted to take. Maybe as a side note, we had Senator Josh Becker from California on the show 2 weeks ago.
Yeah.
So he gave us the
Wonderful.
whole California lowdown, which was really interesting. And let's talk about the AI boom, hype, bubble, whatever you want to call it. Because, I mean, nobody can look into the future, but what we're seeing is unprecedented build out of energy capacity in the US, right? And obviously that's being sucked up by data centers, which is driving up costs and all the rest of it. But I personally think if this doesn't all realize the way that it could, the US might have incredible amounts of cheap energy in the near future, right? But I'm wondering, what is your view of how the unprecedented AI investments link to the future of carbon removal?
Yeah. I mean, I see links to carbon removal, but of course there's also links to decarbonization first and foremost. And so maybe I'll just quickly start there. And a tiny little story is that, when we were at the Department of Energy, there was funding through the infrastructure law for integrated carbon capture and storage projects. And these were to fund the first of a kind CCS demonstrations on natural gas utilities. We had a couple of them that went forward. The Trump administration paused those too. And this was all the same as the DAC hubs. It was overseen by the Office of Clean Energy Demonstrations. And so that was a letdown because EPA can't regulate power plants until there's at least one example to show that it's technically feasible to capture carbon from a natural gas-fired power plant. And so fast forward, we have Google, right? Google set up a project working with ADM, which is essentially a fertilizer company, but ADM was one of the first during the Obama administration, through the Recovery Act funds, had a bioethanol project where they sequestered CO2 in the Mount Simon sandstone in Illinois. And so that, it's not an oil company, it's a fertilizer company, an agriculture company. Google partnered with ADM in order to do carbon capture at a natural gas-fired power plant, coupled to CCS, so it's geologic storage in that same formation. And so that decarbonized electricity is what they're using to build out that data center. And so for the first time ever, we're going to have complete private funding for CCS on gas. So to me, it's like, and that's because Google wants decarbonized power for their data centers. Now, how does it relate to direct air capture, I think, too, is that when you look at direct air capture, especially the solid sorbents like Climeworks, there's a number of companies out there now, but many of them can use like 80 degrees C heat for regeneration. What's true at a data center? They require cooling. And this is oftentimes a community concern, is because of the water needs, right? They require so much water for cooling. Oftentimes the heat that you're pulling away is only 40 degrees C, but you could use a little bit of electricity. Instead of using the electricity to power the air conditioning for the data center, use a little bit of that, 10% of that electricity for a heat pump to bump up from 40 to 80 and use it for regenerating your solid sorbent. Now your direct air capture becomes your air conditioning unit for your data center. And you have the opportunity now. Companies like Microsoft is already starting to invest in this and do this direct air capture to cool data centers. And so to me, it's not about looking at carbon removal in a vacuum. It's like, how do we integrate this with existing infrastructure that's coming, and aligning values in companies like Microsoft and Google that are full on in support of carbon removal, it turns out, in decarbonization.
Fascinating.
It is fascinating. And I'm thinking about the lessons other governments, for example, in the EU could learn from what has happened in the US. Now, obviously, the political risk when it comes to design policies and so on. And it seems to me that this lesson of not looking at one solution in isolation, but looking at many different, at times in Europe, we use industrial symbiosis in the language when we talk about different solutions coming together. This seems to be one of the lessons to kind of bring from all that has happened so far in the US. Anything else that would come to mind to you, like how to safeguard the policies if there are changes in administration coming up?
I I think something we focused on a lot when we were in the administration were communities. And uh, and we called it societal considerations and impacts. So when you think about technologies, whether it's extending the grid or wind or solar or direct air capture, all of these are technologies at the end of the day. And they have to be technologies, if we're going to scale them up, sometimes they're going to bump against people in communities that aren't familiar with them. And I think there needs to be more communication and teaching of what all these technologies are and get communities excited about them and get them to be kind of part of the solutions, get them to be co-owned by communities so that the value isn't just, yes, it's a climate value, it's an environmental impact value, but maybe it's just dollars actually going into communities' pockets too, in ways that are meaningful to communities. And that's always the first question: is what's important? What's the culture? What's the value system of a given community? And also, like, what I find really interesting about decarbonization and carbon removal is that every region is different and there's not going to be one solution for every region. I'm from Maine. Many people get excited about Maine and think of like the coast and the beautiful coast. But in fact, I think of Maine and it equates to forests, and has so much opportunity for carbon removal in terms of improved forest management, maintaining the forest and having sustainable biomass as a feedstock and using it in a responsible way. Oregon is similar, in terms of biomass. There are other states that are wind. South Dakota has so much wind, but not a lot of climate policy, but like every region kind of has different values and different things that they can offer to this set of climate solutions. And I think it's fascinating, but wrapping communities around that so that they feel ownership makes it very difficult for an administration that changes to go in and pull that away. Very difficult. And then and even more so as a student, right? And I'm a professor, but as a student, I'm still a student forever, constantly learning. It's like when you learn something, nobody can take it away, and you grow and you don't go back from that, and I think that that growth, I even think even though the current administration is pausing a lot of things, a lot of dollars did go out the door. A lot of learning was done. A lot of impact was had, and nobody can take that away.
It's a very nice way to put it. And on the community buy-in, we spoke about AI. We're seeing also how that can go wrong when you just go too fast,
Yeah,
right? Like there are now
exactly.
there are good stories already of communities resisting the build-out of data centers because it's just going too fast, not asking for buy-in, and yeah, we need to do better when it comes to carbon removal. One thing that I wanted to ask, I know we're almost up on the hour, but you spoke about 45Q, and this is just something that a question I got a lot in the last weeks. The repeal of the endangerment finding by Trump
Yeah.
at the EPA. What is the connection of that to 45Q, if any?
So the endangerment finding was mostly concerned with automobiles. So it was soot, particulate matter, and it was mostly associated with internal combustion engines, fuels and vehicles. But what the Trump administration, I think, is probably trying to do is extend it to utilities and industrial emitters. But originally, it's really for automobiles, which then, because of that, that's where we saw the explosion of EVs, around the same time, because then that was essentially regulating the automobile industry with internal combustion engines. But if it extends to industry and power plants, which it isn't yet, but if it were to push in that direction, what it would mean, it's like there's no longer an incentive to capture carbon from these facilities, so it would misalign, of course, with 45Q,
So there's an active threat to 45Q, basically.
Yeah, I mean, these things do take time, and again, the endangerment finding is really associated with the transportation sector. So like automobiles, passenger vehicles, and trucking. But it doesn't mean that, we still, it's still scary times, so.
Yeah, and we are now right on time to draw this to a close. So thank you so much for taking the time to join us to share these insights. Some excellent takeaways for different types of stakeholders, some very actionable ones for policymakers, which we always try to deliver here. So yeah, thank you so much for this.
And thank you for everything you've done. Like, the US is the biggest CDR ecosystem in the world in terms of companies, labor force, investment, everything. And I don't want to say you can take all the credit, but you can take some credit.
Thank you.
Thank you for everything you've done. And yeah, thank you for coming on the show.
Thank you both.